Good morning, friends. We've been learning that the only way we can truly be considered righteous is through faith in Jesus Christ, because he is the one who actually accomplished righteousness according to God's perfect standard. He did keep the law perfectly. He met the requirements in and of himself. And that's something we could never do. But we can have the righteousness that Jesus Christ accomplished applied to us through faith in him. And so through that faith, we are justified. We are declared righteous by God. Now, I hope to talk in tomorrow's devotion about how that declaration interacts with the on-the-ground reality, you might say, of our actual experienced righteousness. Because we know that we can't meet the standard of perfection. That's why we rely on Christ. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we throw the whole idea away of being righteous ourselves. We don't just say, well, I can't be perfect, so I won't even try to be holy or righteous in this life. No, because God does call us to holy living. But that process of sanctification, of living in light of what we are, you might say, again, is based on the foundation of our justification. We are declared to be righteous. That's our justification. Therefore, we strive to live in accordance with that. That's our sanctification. But our hope of salvation is rooted not in whatever we manage to accomplish, but in what Christ already did for us. And I hope to unpack that in more depth tomorrow. And it'll come up a little bit later today as well. But I mention this now as a sort of precursor because of something else that can happen. Because people can actually confuse these two ideas. They get justification and sanctification mixed up. They think that they are the same, one and the same, which leads them back to square one, thinking that if they don't perform to a certain level, then they cannot be saved or that they are not saved, which means they start trying to save themselves by being good enough. And in order to do that, people can start distorting the actual standard that God set for us. And this is incredibly dangerous because it is the absolute and perfect nature of that standard which leads us to realize that we can't keep it, which in turn drives us to seek God's mercy and grace through faith in Christ Jesus, which is what actually does produce that justifying righteousness in the eyes of God. Again, justification is something God declares about us. He declares us to be righteous, and that's what saves. Sanctification is the process that follows, wherein we actually do increase in righteousness in our thoughts, words, and deeds here in this life. But if we start downplaying the absolute and perfect requirement of the law, we start thinking, I can do this in my own power. And then we're not trying to be saved by God's justification. We're trying to be saved through our own efforts at sanctification, trying to be good enough. And we see this very clearly as Jesus explains things in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, there's several instances we can go to, but I just want to go to Matthew 5:21 for right now, because Jesus explains in this passage, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." And Jesus continues his explanation, but what we just read is enough to explain the point. The religious leaders of Jesus' day, and really for generations and generations prior, took the most simplistic, easiest approach to God's law possible, at least when it came to convincing themselves that they could keep it. Because Jesus references their own teaching that if a person murders another, then of course they will be subject to judgment. And we think, yep, that makes sense. Do not murder is one of the 10 Commandments. So what's wrong with what they're saying? Well, what's wrong is that they concluded that as long as they were innocent of actually physically, outwardly murdering someone, then they'd fulfill the law. And, that's not actually that difficult. There are a lot of people who have never physically murdered anyone. So check that one off the list. A-okay on that front. And yet Jesus clarifies what the law actually means. Now, some people mistakenly think that Jesus is changing the law here, that he intensifies it in some way. But no, because God does not change, nor do the principles of morality that are based on his unchanging nature, because the law of God is based on who God is. And so God does not change. Therefore, the principles of his law also do not change. Therefore, Jesus is not changing the meaning of the law in any way. He's actually explaining what the law always meant, which means that from the beginning, the command to not murder wasn't just about external physical murder. It was about all things that interact with that very idea, that God is the God of life rather than death, that God is a just God. So any unjust killing, anything that unjustly moves from life to death, is contrary to God's will and would break this command, even if the unjust killing is at the level of the mind. If we are angry with someone, if we harbor that anger in our hearts toward them, which is something we're all familiar with doing, if that's the case, then we are actually murdering that person in our hearts. This is what Jesus is saying. And those thoughts, that inward disposition of anger, Jesus says, is also worthy of being judged. So the law has always had the external part that the religious leaders of Israel were good with, but it also had the internal part that Jesus is here clarifying. Because if we make the law of God merely external, as they were doing, then there are many aspects of the law that would seem to be easy to keep. And in keeping them, we might convince ourselves that we can be righteous in our own power. But that's not an accurate view of what the standard actually is. That's us moving the goalposts to suit our own perceived abilities to make us feel better about ourselves when we, to use a football metaphor in terms of a goalpost, when we split the uprights, despite the fact that we are now standing about 3 yards away and we're actually throwing the ball with our hands rather than kicking it with our feet. But the actual standard of God's law is like having a toddler kick a 63-yard field goal in the middle of a hurricane. It can't be done. But again, if we move the goalpost to suit ourselves, then we convince ourselves we can meet the standard, but that isn't actually God's standard, and we need to realize that. And this happens in many Christian circles today, unfortunately. There's a rather popular idea in some Christian traditions called perfectionism. It's actually given different titles to try to get around that word of perfect, but they all have the same problem. The idea is that God calls us to be holy and perfect and righteous, therefore we must be able to accomplish that here and now. That's one problem. It's sort of an over-realized eschatology, which is when someone takes something that will be true, will be a reality in eternity, but they act like it should be reality now. Because it is true, one day we will be stripped of our sinfulness fully and completely, and we will be made fully righteous, perfect, and holy. But that day is not this day. In any case, however, to get this idea of perfectionism or whatever else it might be called to work, people then have to downgrade the reality of sin. People will say, well, I know I have sin in my life, so I'm not perfect in that sense, but I am still considered righteous in the eyes of God because of what I do, because I no longer have purposeful sin or willful sin or knowing sin. If I do sin, it's without understanding that I'm sinning, or it's an accident. I don't realize it. So I no longer purposefully sin, therefore I am righteous. Now, first off, show me the person who never sins even in a knowing way. I've never seen one. I certainly don't. I don't belong to that category. Even the Apostle Paul admitted that he knew when he was sinning. This is in Romans 7. He knew when he was sinning, and he still ended up doing it in full knowledge. So that's one issue. People who hold this view can't meet the standard even after moving the goalposts. But even if we give them that claim and assume that they can, still, what right does anyone have to shift the goalposts in the first place? Sin is sin, even if it is a sin done in ignorance. I mean, this is very clearly demonstrated throughout the scriptures. In the Old Testament sacrificial system, there was still sacrifices required for unknown sin. It's still sin. It still requires a sacrifice, and that sin still requires the ultimate sacrifice of Christ for our faith in Him. But in any case, so we are reaffirming the idea that falling short of God's perfect standard is still falling short, whether you meant to or not. Because again, my 12-year-old boys try that excuse out. They do something wrong, or they break something, or whatever happens, and they say, but I didn't mean to, but they still did. It still happened. It was still wrong. And so we just really need to be careful about this, because God is gracious, and we can get doctrine wrong and still be saved. But this is one that really makes me nervous, because we understand that we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, not faith in any aspect of what we can do. And if a person truly is trusting in their own works, if they demand that their effort has to be included in their salvation, even if they trust in Jesus for the majority of it, even the vast majority of their salvation, but again, they're convinced that they have to contribute to their own salvation by their own efforts, by what they do, is that person saved? I honestly don't know. Because again, I don't know, because I lean toward that, hedging my bet, so to speak, because God is gracious and he can save whom he wants to in his grace. But at the same time, I lean toward the idea that they're not saved, because God says he will not share his glory with anyone. And the whole reason, and this is stated specifically and explicitly in Ephesians 2, 8 through 10, the whole reason he brings us salvation by grace through faith, and that faith not of ourselves, is so that no one can boast about contributing to their own salvation. So this is a serious issue. We must embrace these two things, which logically follow from each other. The first thing is, God's standard is an absolute and perfect standard that does not change, and we can't meet it, not ever, in our own power. And secondly, therefore, our only hope is to trust in the grace of God to save us through the faith that he grants us to have, again, by his grace, to have that faith in Jesus Christ, because he did meet the standard. 100% Jesus, 0% us. And yes, as I mentioned a moment ago, as a result, we are to strive to live in accordance with the righteousness that we've been credited with, but that comes after we are saved. It is the product of being saved. It is not something we rely upon to get saved. I hope this clarifies some of the dangers out there so that we can avoid these faulty notions of salvation. And that means we can be all the more assured of our salvation, because we are not relying on ourselves in any way, to any degree. Rather, we're relying 100% on the Son of God himself and his perfect righteousness that is credited to our account through our faith in him. I love you guys. I pray you have a good and godly day. And Lord willing, I'll see you soon.